Hello and welcome to Page and Screen with John Paul Sarney. This past year has offered a treasure trove of new books about old subjects and queer lives in England over the past 500 years. And I've chatted with Will Tosh about straight acting, the many queer lives of William Shakespeare on this podcast. Also, Lucy Hughes Hallett explored the brilliant brief life of the Duke of Buckingham, and Gareth Russell's Queen James recounted the loves of James I. Now, a new book takes us across 18th century England and the lives of several secret or not so secret men and women who hid from or ran to their queer selves, often in the face of gossip, peril, and even death by hanging. These are stories that will recall encounters you've seen on screen in series like Bridgerton and Gentleman Jack, though the truth is far stranger than the Hollywood confections. Dr. Anthony Delaney is the author of Queer Georgians, which is out now in the UK, and in North America, it's entitled Queer Enlightenment. With a PhD in history, he is a presenter on the history hit podcast After Dark. He also likes to hide books around the historical hotspots of London. Please welcome to the program, Anthony Delaney.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's lovely. It's lovely to meet you. I've loved watching everything you're doing on Instagram to promote the book, because you have been finding little spots around town to tuck some books away, and you're doing quite the tour at the same time. So you're really traversing the nation, aren't you?
Yeah, it's really it's hard to sell a debut nonfiction. This is my first book, and it's harder still when it's a queer history book. And so I really wanted to, by the time it has finished its kind of course of life, I wanted to make sure that it I had done everything I could to make sure people knew it existed. So yeah, we've been putting the book on some of the sites across London that are associated with the book, or that appear in the book. We have been up and down the country. I'm in a hotel in, where am I? Bath right now, and I'll tell you, it's been really special meeting everybody generally, but particularly if I'm going into queer bookshops specifically, or queer spaces, queer events. It takes on a whole other level of meaning and significance for people, and it's just been really, really special. So yeah, it's been a hard graft, but it's been very rewarding at the same time.
Well, very good. And for those who might not know, because it is a very specific world that we're talking about, so if you wouldn't mind, just set the stage for us. What years are we looking at in England? So what does the world look like at this moment that you are exploring? It's a little more than maybe like 120 years of history.
Yeah, so the Georgian period tends to be sought after in the 1714 to 1836. So just before Victoria comes to the throne. And we've got all the Georges, one, two, three, and four, and then William the Fourth tacked on there at the end for good measure. As you mentioned, in North America, the book is called Queer Enlightenments, and the book ends, the last two chapters of the book are set in New York. And that's one of the reasons why we renamed the book for the North American audience. The publishers, my American publishers, were slightly concerned that they would feel that it was about people who lived in the state of Georgia. So to avoid any conflict there, they renamed the book. But we're dealing with a time that's sometimes referred to as the Enlightenment. So therefore, that's where that title comes from. People are asking an awful lot about the world. They're questioning an awful lot about their existence, about what it means to be a human being. The kind of dominance of religion is slowly but surely changing, not necessarily going, but changing. And this idea that there are other ways of being are very much coming to the forefront. Now, I will say, you have to remember that all of that kind of frippery, discovery, enlightenment, thought exercise is also happening against the backdrop of the huge expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. So this is not necessarily a glorious, glittering time for everybody by any stretch of the imagination. But that is the time period under investigation here. And in the book, we start in 1726 in London, at a working class molly house. So that sets the tone for what's to come.
Excellent. And obviously, queer people have been around forever. I'm coming to you now from Italy, and there's certainly a storied past of of queer people in the history of this country. But specifically here, during these times, there were a lot of laws coming into play. And you talk about that a little bit in the book. Marriage was essentially enforceable by law, wasn't it? And people could get married from a very shockingly young age.
Yeah, marriage is one of the things that was a bit of a kind of a light bulb moment for me as I was doing this research. So we're kind of led to believe that the history of same-sex marriage begins in, depending on where you live, say about 2015 or thereabouts. But actually, what I have discovered in the book is that the language of marriage is percolating all of these histories to a really, really serious extent, to such an extent that I think it would be improper from now on to talk about the history of same-sex marriage without at least beginning in 1726. And I hazard before that, but I have the archival evidence for 1726 at the earliest, because what we see before 1753, with the introduction of the Hardwicke Marriage Act, we have a situation when it comes to marriage that to become married, you have to have one witness and just the two people who want to marry. And we see queer people emulating that structure of marital relationship, even though the law wouldn't, even prior to 1753, wouldn't have extended to two men or two women. They are still using that formulation and that's kind of the structures of that institution to solidify their own relationships, because we have been told that that's not happening. We've been told that the any queer connections are very fleeting, or they're very, purely sexually driven. And there's a lot of sex in there too. But we also are in this book getting an idea about intimacy and closeness and love and joy and companionship. So a much fuller, a much more colorful, and a much more rewarding life than potentially we might have expected, because that's not what we've been told to expect. So marriage is one of the ways in which that love, comfort, joy is formulated, and we see a concerted effort throughout the book, from the first chapter, which, as I say, takes place in 1726, to the last in New York in 1836, and marriage comes up in all of those chapters. So it really is a recurring theme.
And now for the book, I mean, there are several stories that go more or less chronologically throughout these 100 plus years. Are these stories that, from your work as a historian, you were aware of these characters in England and Ireland and France and other places? You were vaguely aware of them, and then you started to did like a bit of a deep dive when you looked at the book, or were you going on a specific search to find these queer lives in history?
Some of them I was aware of. Some of them appear in my PhD. So chapters 1 to 5 in this book are, no, chapters 1 to 4 in this book are also linked to my PhD research. Not entirely, but they are linked. And they're in a very different format now, obviously. But so those people I had already worked on. I'd been in their archives for years before I even started writing the book officially. There are other people, I'm talking about people like the Chevalier d'Eon, the Ladies of Llangollen, and Lister, of course, that then didn't appear in the PhD, but who are very central to this book. And they're people that I knew about, that I was aware of, but I hadn't done any primary source or actual archival research on any of them. So I was just taking for granted what I had received as information, as being fact. But actually, when I got into the archive, it was, there were revelations in there that we've overlooked, and that was really exciting as well. In terms of the final two, George Wilson and Mary Jones, I probably knew them least of all. Mary Jones I hadn't even heard of, although I see her kind of doing the rounds a little bit now on social media. So that was also interesting in terms of, really meeting these people where you find them in their historic moment in time. But it was a combination of people I knew very well, people I was aware of, just in popular culture, and then people that were kind of new to me, newly discovered to me, which made for a kind of a very rewarding research process, I have to say.
Well, and at the very beginning, because all of these stories are truly cinematic in their own way. I mean, many of them could, should and probably will eventually become movies. But the very beginning, when you talk about the Molly houses, I had just read maybe a year ago this great, wonderful novel, The Betrayal of Thomas True by A.J. West, and which is set against the backdrop of the Molly houses. And everyone I know who has read this book was unaware of what these places were. I mean, he brings it to life so beautifully and so cinematically. So to begin in this very first story, because it's so unique, what were the Molly houses? What were these places that people went?
Well, I think one of the things that stuck out to me when I was researching the first two chapters, because that's what makes up the Molly House chapters, is that we've slightly overlooked the complexity of what Molly houses were. So the received idea is that Molly houses were places that men who wanted to have sex with other men went to frequent. They were under the cover of some kind of a drinking spot, maybe a coffee house, an ale house, something like that. We're not entirely sure. And with Mother Clapp's Molly House, which is the Molly House in question here, we really aren't 100% sure. It was described as a coffee house, an ale house, all different types of things. But my instinct is that it's fulfilling all of those functions, actually, that it's not just, she's an entrepreneur, she's running this business, and so she is doing everything she can to eke a living as a working class woman. But for the men involved, Sunday night was the busiest night at Mother Clapp's Molly House, and up to about 40 men. So there is very much a sense of community here. Up to about 40 men were meeting every Sunday night, and they were meeting for, as I say, joy, for camaraderie, to share their experiences. We find out, and this was known for quite some time, but we find out that they had maiden names for one another. So an orange seller from Covent Garden was known as Orange Deb, for instance, or the Duchess of Camomile was a man who lived on Camomile Street in London. So these are naming rituals that show that you are one of us, and they really give this sense of community, which prior to the study of the Molly houses was absolutely not thought to have existed, but it very much did. But because they were such safe havens for people, they also were places where they lived. It wasn't just a place you could come and go. You could lodge there. And we know that there's at least two men living together in Mother Clapp's Molly House on the night that it's raided. But yes, because it provided this kind of safe haven, the Society for the Reformation of Manners, that was a kind of religious organization at the time, had infiltrated their numbers, and there was literally spies amongst them. And that night in February 1726, they're both inside and outside, waiting to pounce and raid the Molly House, and they really do. And it's 40, about 40. The number in the archives say about 40 men were arrested. I think it's probably an exaggeration, because that would mean everybody was arrested, but we know that some people got away. But still, a lot of people were arrested that night, taken for processing, and then some of them, again, maybe about a quarter of them, were taken to Newgate prison before their trial. So, it's a place of hope, and it's a place of community, but also, when your life is at stake, as it was for these men, then it's, the stakes are really, really high here. You cannot close that door behind you without potentially putting your life at risk. And there are no higher stakes, right?
Right. And I think that also what's very interesting is you really get into detail once certain people do go to Newgate and they're kind of awaiting trial. This was not an expedient process for people that were, accused of sodomy or anything like that. I mean, it was a very long. I mean, some of the verbiage was very quick, and they were deemed guilty very quickly. But it was sometimes quite a long time before they were maybe hanged. So can you talk a little bit about, what that process was like? And because there was a very specific way that it was done, and also the way that, not to be too gruesome, but I was interested that you talk about the way that hanging actually happens and how it's meant to work, and it didn't always work as it was meant to.
Yeah, so I'll concentrate on Gabriel Lawrence, I suppose, because he's the easiest one to track the whole way through. Other Mollies were taken up, some didn't survive Newgate, and we can talk about that in just a second. But so Gabriel Lawrence is arrested. He is processed by a justice of the peace. He then goes to Newgate, where he's held. So Newgate is a prison, but it's not a prison in the way we would understand it. In that it's kind of a processing house. You're held there until your trial, really. And obviously there is no human rights involved in this. This is a horrendous place. Gabriel Lawrence, being a working class man, would have been on the Commons side. There was a Master's side and a Commons side, and if you wanted to be on the Master's side, it was a bit more comfortable, but you had to pay for that. He wouldn't have been able to afford the prices involved there. But what I discovered in the course of the research for this book, and I don't think this has appeared anywhere else before, is it appears, according to an inmate from the time, and very close to when Gabriel Lawrence was there, that there was a specific place referred to as the buggering hold for men who had sex with other men who were arrested. And the man that's describing this place says how horrendous it is. The lice are crackling under your feet there. It is infested. He says, he compares it to shells on a garden, which was very popular in the 18th century. So the walls are literally crawling. We also know that people are getting ill with jail fever. They do not survive. We know certainly at least one Molly doesn't survive his time in Newgate, so he doesn't make it to trial. And it is a place, it was, Henry Fielding called it London's prototype of hell. So it was a place that you did not want to go. That you spent a bit of time in there, you were shackled, you were bound, you'd eat at regulated times, and the food wasn't great. And then you'd go to the Old Bailey. You'd have your trial at the Old Bailey. And this was a very regulated, very formalized, but as you said, quick. 30 minutes probably is how long an individual trial would have lasted. And it's up to you to defend yourself. There are no, at this point in the 18th century, there are no lawyers acting on your behalf. If the jury have a question, they're just going to shout it out in the middle of your testimony. So it was referred to as kind of managed chaos at the time. So it is a show, it is an event, it is, traumatic, I'm sure, for the people involved. And for Gabriel Lawrence, his family, his friends, and his neighbors all turn up to say, this is a good man. They also say, it's probably worth noting, he could never have done this because he used to be married to a woman, and he has a child, so there's no way he could have been sleeping with men. We don't know what they knew and what they didn't know. There's a world in which they didn't know anything, and Gabriel Lawrence just knew what the life he was living. But there's also a world in which maybe some of them did and just didn't. There was no defense for sodomy. If it was proven that you had done it, you were going to hang. So there's probably very little need to argue the human element of being same-sex attracted at this time. It was to prove that you did not do it. But Gabriel is found guilty, goes to Tyburn, and there's about 100,000 people who turn up for that execution. I think there's about 6 people being executed that day, including a very famous murderer who had killed her husband and decapitated him along with her new lover. So this was a celebrity hanging essentially for the time. There's so many people that they jostle into the hanging tree, and part collapses. There is stadium seating temporarily erected around what is now Marble Arch in London. So this is an event. It is raucous. People are pushing and shoving. There's people singing, selling ballads, selling food. It's not what we might imagine a very somber event to be. And yeah, Gabriel is taken under the hanging tree. He's taken a noose placed around his neck, and he's on a cart that is led by a horse, and the horse then moves away, and he drops. And that's where we leave Gabriel. That's the kind of last archival trace of him. So it's a very I start with probably the most harrowing history, I think. There are other difficult points. But one of the things that I wanted to be really aware to point out during this is that before Gabriel's end, Gabriel's life is full of joy and community and love and sex and all the things that make a life a full life. So I think we've often, when we tell these Molly histories, we often concentrate on that last drop point, which is totally understandable, and it's important to acknowledge that. But what I wanted to kind of bring to life in this was the life that had happened before, and concentrate on that with the other protagonists as well. So I think it's also important to look at that side of things.
Well, yes, and I think that also the interesting thing about the Molly House is that there was this real sense of community and people did know each other. And I think that also extends into, as further into the book, you talk about there were these men, a lot of men who were of means, who came from a bit of family money, who had maybe done like a grand tour of Europe, who found ways to very much in plain sight, live with one another and live with other men. And I thought it was very interesting. You talk about the expenses that some of these guys had with putting their homes together and spending obscene amounts of money on things like candlesticks. But it's through those records that you found that you discover what was actually going on behind closed doors, that this man might be married to a woman, but there was another man on the side, and a lot of people were able to organize. They were able to get past the days of the Molly houses and find more community and places of safety for themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's a class thing too, right? So it's exactly what you're talking about. These men were able to afford to do that. These men, like the likes of John Lord Harvey or John Shute, who occupy different chapters in the book, they would never have set foot in the Molly House. And I think often if you, well, it's not depicted on screen very often, but if you see a Molly House, there was a great period drama. I don't know, it's probably 20 plus years ago now, called City of Vice, and one episode was set in a Molly House, and it was just such a really interesting depiction. And what you'll see often is, and I think there's a Molly House in Taboo as well, a fictional Molly House. But what you will see is that it's a real melting pot of class. That wasn't the case in history. It was very much a working class space. The elite would never have gone to some of these Molly houses. Because they were in such bad areas. Mother Claps is definitely one of those. Now, that said, they were forming community. They had those big country houses, they had those big townhouses. So they were able to form their community within that domestic sphere. And they did. But it's interesting that you mentioned some of the wives. Mary Lepel was John Lord Harvey's wife, and she was a brilliant courtier before she married John. And she very much acknowledges her husband's relationship with Stephen Fox, because and she misses her husband terribly, and she is heartbroken. It's not a very pleasant experience for her a lot of the time. But she forms this really strong bond with Stephen Fox, which endures beyond her husband's life, even. And so she writes to him and she says, how is he? Is he suffered from bad health? And she was like, how is he feeling? Make sure he's having this food, and make sure that he's warm and dressed in this coat. And so we find this acknowledgement and this kind of co-spousal caregiving thing happening in the 18th century, where, now I'm not saying that was for all women, but we have that for Molly Lepel. We have her words, we have her letters, making this very clear. And then Stephen is replying in kind, going, of course we'll come to Ickworth, where they lived, their country seat. But it was up to Stephen to arrange for Molly to see her husband, because John just kind of lost interest and wasn't coming home and didn't really write to her. He would every now and again, he'd pick up the pen, and she would be so delighted by the arrival of these letters. But it was up to Stephen to bring him home sometimes, and he did bring him home. And I think it's interesting to see that dynamic between that those three people, which is complex, but they find a way, as you hinted there, they find a way to make their lives work together. So it's interesting, it's heartwarming as well, and it's difficult because Molly is just incredible. Molly Lepel, she's incredible.
Well, and also speaking of the women, because you do get into this as well. There's a pair of women. We've been talking a lot about the men, but there's a pair of women that you reference in the book that you talk quite a bit about, who who you name among your ancestors, who literally have to jump through some windows, to find their way to each other or out of trouble. Can you talk a little bit about these women from Ireland?
Yeah, I should point out, just for factual accuracy, when I say they're my ancestors, I see them as my queer ancestors as opposed to my blood ancestors. I'm not actually related to them, but the
That
reason
you
I
know of. I mean, who knows?
well, listen, that's true. Who knows? I'm having my DNA done at the moment for a project on our own podcast, so it's who knows what will turn up. That would be amazing. It Yeah, they're from the same county in Ireland as I'm from, a very small county called Kilkenny. And I grew up there and couldn't wait to get out of the place, because I just didn't feel like I fit in. I didn't feel like there was other queer people. I mean, subsequently, half the people I went to bloody school with have turned out to be queer. But it was a different time. I mean, I grew in Ireland when I grew up. It was still illegal to be gay. So that is, although I'm not necessarily aware of that as a child, it's infiltrating to some extent. So I always felt like I needed to leave. And when I was going home, even until recently, I was like, oh God, I have to compromise myself a little bit when I go home, because this is what I have to do when I'm in Kilkenny. So discovering, and that was on me. Ireland has changed so much in the last 10, 15 years. It's incredible now. But it's to discover the ladies of Clongauchlin are who we're talking about here. Just to be clear, it's Lady Eleanor Butler and Miss Sarah Ponsonby, and they became quite famous in Britain for their Welsh cottage that loads of dignitaries came to. The King and Queen George III and Charlotte were aware of them. They sent them a pension. It was only £50 a year, but it was an acknowledgement of their really individual lives. But I concentrated this book on their story prior to that domestic life, and the kind of struggle and the drama that they encountered, which is there's pistols drawn at dawn, there's a couple of runaways, there's yapping dogs, there's speeding carriages. They're trying to escape Ireland together. And then there's this kind of family tension at the heart of it as well, where their families do not know what to do with these two women who are determined to be together. And I just thought, we have this idea of them as older women, and they're settled and they're domestic and they have this very polite existence, I just thought there was something about the Irish history that is always kind of skipped over, that was far more radical, maybe, certainly more dramatic. And that was what attracted me as a Kilkenny man. And I honestly felt so much more connected to my own history and my own place in Kilkenny, because of them. And I went, this is a history I could have really done with knowing when I was 13 years of age, and felt that I was some kind of oddity in this small kind of rural place. So it's given me an awful lot of pride and empowerment. And that is one of the things that's coming across more and more for me as I get to meet particularly queer people, but not just queer people, as I'm doing this book tour. And it was apparent to me as I was writing these, one of the reasons we've been denied these histories in this complexity is because they are empowering. I find them so uplifting, even with some of the difficult details. And I think that's a dangerous thing. And I mean danger in a good way. Particularly now when queer people are being questioned again, and our very existence is being questioned in some quarters. It's an empowering thing to know that you've always been here and that there are people who have gone before you. And this doesn't begin with Oscar Wilde. That's another thing that we've been misdirected towards. Okay, well, the language was invented in the 19th century, so we can talk about queer lives from the 19th century onwards. No, it's here before. The archive is indisputable. And hopefully what's in Queer Georgians shows that, and gifts that to people. I always say that Queer Georgians is an invitation back into our history. Yes, for queer people, but for everybody, because these are histories of brothers, sisters, children, fathers, sons, daughters. This is everybody's history, and it's a history we've been denied. So in order to complete, or head towards completing that picture, that invitation has to be open to everybody. And I hope people accept it and walk into this book with open eyes and open hearts, and see and feel, actually more tellingly still, feel what this past might have been like for these people, so we can go forward ourselves in a more empowered state.
Well, and there's so many wonderful stories, and I would love to talk about all of them, but I think there'll be wonderful surprises for people when they read the book as well. But I mean, that's a good it's a good comments to come to an end on, because we are in this very interesting moment where we see certain things in the news that the rainbow sidewalks are being painted over by the American government, and Hillary Clinton is telling people, if you're gay, you better hurry up and get married now, because that might go away, the same way as Roe v. Wade. But then at the same time, a few days ago here in Italy, there was a queer pilgrimage to the Vatican. We have a pope who is embracing what the previous pope had done, which is to do their best to do things that are unprecedented and welcome in the gay community. So, I mean, how do you see the coming years? I mean, there's obviously two sides, and it depends on very much depends on where you live and what the government where you live is up to. But I mean, I think there's always cause for optimism, but I'm curious, as you look back, it's always looking back, then we start to look forward again and make those connections between the past and what is to come.
For me, I think the biggest thing that I took from the writing the book and researching the book, and seeing patterns through history, is that we need to show up at this moment in time for each other, all of us, but particularly for our trans brothers and sisters who are experiencing, we talk about the I saw that on the news just yesterday, actually, the march at the Vatican, and that's incredible. I'm not religious myself, but I can see how that does something for queer people who are, and I think if that's empowering them, then that's incredible. What we are also dealing with, however, and sadly, is a very concerted effort to physically and socially and culturally dismantle our trans brothers and sisters. Um, and I think that is our responsibility now, to show up in those spaces in whatever way showing up for you looks like. So for me, showing up, I hope, looks like writing this book and platforming some, for me, very inspiring, what we would now term trans histories. And I think we need to look community wide. I think we're not out of the woods. I think it might get worse before it gets better, to be perfectly honest. That's my instinct on what I'm seeing. Again, I think you're right to say it really depends on where you live. Bear in mind, there are people in the world right now whose lives are at risk because they are same-sex attracted or because they have trans their gender identity, whatever it might be. So I think until we have better community cohesion, and we don't abandon those people within our community who are being very, very deliberately targeted. They didn't, the sense of community in the Mary Jones history, which is the final chapter in the book, for instance, and the sense of Mary, and Mary is what we would now term a trans woman. She is, I think, to me, the most inspiring person. And the reason being, Mary gets arrested, and Mary's a thief. We know that for sure. She's not without her troubles, and she's trying to survive in a world that does not want her to exist or survive. But what she does, which I think is the most inspiring thing, is not change legislation. She doesn't change world events. She's not shaping the new world order. But what she is doing every single time is getting up and showing up. She goes to prison so many times, and yet she comes back, and we leave her. And I was so glad that the archive led us here. But we leave her in the end of the book, walking down a street in New York in her finery. She looks stunning, and even people who hate her are commenting on how amazing she looks. And I think there is this idea that if Mary wandering off into the future and we don't know what happens to her in the end, and I kind of love that. I know it can be frustrating for some readers, but for me that represents hope. And I think at this moment in time, getting up like Mary Jones did, showing up like Mary Jones did, and using hope as our anchor across the community and across society more generally, is the way to go forward. So I think that for me is, we have to be hopeful, we have to be positive, but we also have to be there for each other. And I think there's, we all know, even within the queer community, that there's a lot of difficult division, and I don't think it's serving any of us. So that for me is the key thing that I took away from these histories. Going, this is a community wide history. This isn't sectioned into the L or the G or the B or the T or the Q, whatever. This is community wide, and I think we need to be thinking a little bit more like that, as we head into what might be a difficult few years ahead.
Well said. Very well said. Well, Anthony Delaney, thank you so much for those words. Thank you for the book, which is Queer Georgians, or Queer Enlightenment if you're in North America. It is available now. And if people want to go get it, I know you're touring all over the UK right now. Is there an independent bookshop that you'd love to send people to pick up a copy?
Yeah, there's a few, and there's a few queer. So we have Gaze the Word in London, we have the Bookish Type in Leeds, we have Queer Lit in Manchester. So those are some of the independent queer bookshops that I've been appearing at. I'm at the Bookish Type in Leeds tonight, actually. So yeah, head over to them and give them your custom. They're a great bunch across all of those shops. They have been absolutely brilliant, and the crowds have been brilliant there too as well. So yeah, give them a look and see what else they've got in stock, as well as Queer Georgians.
Wonderful. Well, Anthony Delaney, thank you for joining me, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.